Perfect.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Capital Analyst. Our guest today is Tushar Anand. Tushar is the co founder of Shepherd Foods Private Limited, a Delhi based cloud kitchen that provides services under three brands: Pizza on My Plate, Burger in My Box, and Delhi Salad Company. Tushar is a valedictorian from London School of Economics in their management program. After short stints at Uber and Deloitte, he started his own entrepreneurship firm, and he also serves as an angel investor at Point One Capital. Welcome to the show, Tushar. How are you doing?
All good, Prabal. Really nice catching up. It's been a long time and it's been long due. Congratulations on this new journey that you have started, the whole podcasts around multiple topics. And I hope all the podcasts fare out well and it kind of reaches a wider audience and they kind of learn from it and then use all the things that they're listening to in these podcasts to enhance their entrepreneurial journey, their life, whatever they seem fit.
Sure. So thanks a lot, Tushar, for those words. So let's dive right in. So for the benefit of the listeners, can you first explain what exactly is a cloud kitchen?
So it's kind of the word came into parlance, I think in 2016, 2015. That was the time when people started hearing about cloud kitchens, and a lot of people in the US also at that time called it dark kitchens. So the kind of the real reasoning behind naming it dark kitchens was that it used to be in not very run-of-the-mill locations. It used to be in dingy locations, back of the alley, places where a normal restaurant would never open up, places where customers would not find it easy to go park and order their food. And what this did was that a big component for the restaurant industry is always their rents. So most of the players in the dine-in space and the QSR space end up paying a good amount of rent wherever they take their premises. Whereas in the concept of a dark kitchen, the rent factor went down from an average 12% of your revenues to almost 2 to 3%. So that 7-8% saving kind of just impacted the whole profitability of the operation. So that's why the dark and the cloud kitchen concept uh, uh, came into normal common parlance. I think for cloud it was majorly because it was like cloud centers that big companies have in on these countries in Southeast Asia, wherein most of the back end work happens. So it kind of also stems from there, wherein you call it a cloud kitchen, something where the customers cannot go, but only the delivery boys can go pick up the food and then deliver it to the customer. So I guess the whole critical differentiation between a cloud kitchen, normal kitchen was the rent factor.
Okay, great. So let's talk about how you ended up starting a cloud kitchen. So you plunged into entrepreneurship straight after your MBA. So how did you come to that decision, and why start a new thing, something like a cloud kitchen in the first place?
So actually, it's a funny story, but just to correct you, I didn't do my MBA. I was doing a master's program.
Mm-hmm.
So post that, a friend of mine whom I knew from school, and I hadn't talked to him for 4 or 5 years, and we got connected at a party, and then he suggested me this new plan, this new business that he was about to start. So he kind of told me about it, and I got a little intrigued by it, and then the classic investor trope wherein you tell someone about something and then tell him that no, it's not available now, maybe you can try later, maybe in the next venture I can let you in. So I think that trope was played on me, and I couldn't get in at that time. Cut to, I think, 2 3 months later, I get a message from the same friend that what, one of my investors has backed out, so if you are still interested, you can come and partner with me. And I think it was Jan 2018, if I remember correctly. And I had a 6 month break because I was planning to go for an MBA that year itself. So I was, just thinking about writing my essays and my SOPs, and then applying by the second deadline back in Jan. And I was like, you know what? I think I should give it a shot. I should try this for a year. And if it doesn't work, I can go for an MBA next year. The max what I'll do is, I'll learn something. And at that time, the investment amount was also not very huge. It was a very small ticket investment that we were kind of planning to do at that time. So I said yes to it, and we started off in Jan 2018. Uh, and I still am a part of the company. Almost 4 years down the line. I think 2 months in the next 2 months we'll be completing 4 years in this company. So I actually never ended up going for an MBA. I never ended up, the company worked well and it still continues to do well. So it's just something that I got stuck in, to be honest, not something that I, chose very honestly. And initially, I actually thought that this would be something where uh, it'll run for 4 5 months and then we'll probably end shut shop. And even if it runs very well, I'll probably ask my partner to buy me out, buy my stake out, and then I can probably venture out, go for an MBA or do something else. But because it was kind of a two-man led operation, it was something where we could never take a day off. So we had to be involved. I think the restaurant or the food services industry, it's a business where you're kind of involved 24/7. Even when you're not working, you're thinking about vendors, you're thinking about supplies, you're thinking about recipes, you're thinking about customers. So that never ends. So it is kind of like a 24/7, 365 days a year a job. Uh, so we never got time off. It ran off well. It started growing at a very fast pace. The recognition started coming very early, and even before we knew it, it kind of became something of its uh, something of prominence in the areas that we serve.
Sure. So whenever you start a new startup, generally people are looking for product market fit or trying to find a gap in the market which has not been addressed right now. So when you started your pizza chain, there were already major QSR players like Domino's and Pizza Hut. Even a lot of quasi cloud chain players like Mojo Pizza and Aman Story were already
Yeah.
operating in this space. So what factors were going in your mind that this is the way we want to distinguish and how we can make a difference by selling pizza, which is something that a lot of companies have been doing?
So, see, Prabal, at that time also this question was very prominent. It played on our minds for a long time. And the thinking that we had at that time was that if we kind of give something similar to Domino's at, 10 plus 10-15% of their prices, there's no reason for the customer to order from us because we'll not be able to offer that quality sustenance and that delivery speed or that visibility across these multiple locations initially. So there was no incentive for the customer to come to us. So that door of mimicking Domino's, which a lot of new cloud kitchen chains do, some of the ones that you named, that kind of would never was very attractive at the start. And then there were at that time I remember in 2017, 2018, there were either five-star pizza joints wherein you could go to a five-star hotel and eat a 1200, 1300 rupee pizza, or you could order Domino's. We kind of thought that there's this premium economy segment which does not have a lot of players, but we thought it had a lot of takers. So there were a lot of people who would not want to order 1,000 rupee pizza every day, but would at the same time not want to order a 200 to 300 rupee pizza as well. So this was the spot where people are looking for a 400, 500, 600 rupee price bracketed pizza brand. And that's what something we decided that, even if you see airlines for that matter, most of the times the premium economy, although the seats are less, it is kind of 100% occupied. The economy seats might not be occupied, the business class might not be occupied, the first class seats might not be occupied, but premium economy more often than not is 100% occupied. So it's a very sweet spot considering the market segment that we operated in. The customers were there, but the options weren't there. So we kind of stuck to this premium economy story. Our brand was a premium economy brand. It promised luxury offerings at a premium economy price to a mass market. Now, of course, we couldn't cater to the market that was looking for Domino's. Absolutely, someone who would have looked for a 250 or a 300 rupee pizza. So that's something that we never started chasing from the start. So I think that premium economy segment idea worked pretty well for us. And I think once people started seeing the success of our brands, a lot of brands actually started coming into that category. So now actually premium economy is kind of crowded, something which it wasn't a few years back.
Sure. And so I wanted to know that since your brand particularly pitches authentic Italian flavors as one of the
Yeah.
key separating elements for the premium economy segment, how easy or how difficult it was to set up supply chains to source these raw materials, and how have you been able to pivot them during the pandemic?
So I'll tell you an interesting fact. So with the pandemic, we weren't shut for a single day or an hour for that matter. And I can tell you, even a brand like Domino's was shut for a few days in the first wave. Even the second wave, a few of their outlets were shut. Now, of course, because of the scale that they are, for them to procure licenses, passes, raw materials, it's very difficult to do at that scale instantly, something that we kind of are able to do because of the small scale that we operate in. With supply chains, I think when we started, the one thing that we knew, see, both me and the other founder, we didn't come from a food background. So it was more of a lot of research we did online, what worked well, what's the fit that goes onto the pizza, what's a good quality tomato, what's a good quality cheese that should go on. The topic should be baked, charred, fried, what should be done to them. So a lot of this was hit and trial from our end. We went to a lot of good places, we ate a lot of food, we tried to understand what was working for which place, and then we tried to create an amalgamation of all the good things around the good places that we went to. And because there was no food background, we couldn't experiment on our own. But luckily, what was very clear in our mind was that we'll till the end try to give the best quality raw materials, ingredients in the food, and that in itself will translate to a good food experience for the customer, and that will make sure that he'll come back again and again, and create a big repeat base for us. So we kind of never tried low quality mozzarella. From day one, we went to the best vendor that we knew in the city, the best mozzarella that was available. Although it was very expensive, I think we were buying mozzarella almost at 100% premium at what other players use. So it was already affecting our cost in the start, but I think it helped us in the long run by building a good base around it. So for mozzarella, we kind of looked at a vendor which had a bespoke setup where they had created the temperature of the Flanders regions of Belgium, and they created cheese around that temperature, which was a lot of people weren't doing. So same for the tomatoes that we were using, same for the flour that we were using. So it was initially, it wasn't, to be honest, it wasn't that difficult because by the time we had started, the supply chains had already become very good across the city. So to be honest, I think post 2007, 8, especially in Delhi and Gurgaon, you could get all the kinds of cheeses that you want. You could get all the kind of flours that you wanted. You could have imported Italian tomatoes across the city. So supply chain, to be honest, wasn't a big issue for us to start with. And luckily, over the last 2, 3 years, the supply chains have also kind of expanded over to tier two, tier three cities as well. If not tier three, but at least all the tier two cities as well. So maybe in 2018, it would have been difficult to replicate it across different cities, but come 2022, I think it's a very easy thing to do across different cities.
Okay, so the way I see it, like there were three things going on. First of all, you were doing a business for which there were not a lot of previous cases to bank upon. It was a slightly newer field.
Yes.
Secondly,
Yeah.
you were not from food background, as you mentioned. Neither you nor your partner were
Yeah.
from the food background. And third, this was a completely
Yeah.
bootstrap startup. You had invested your own money. So, given that
Yes.
these three risk factors, like what are the kind of benchmarks you set for yourself to know that you are going in the right direction as a company, and this is something that you can pursue?
See, eventually, I think whenever someone starts a business, I think the first benchmark that they have is that at least we get back the money we invested in. So if you put in, let's say, 10 lakh rupees as the principal amount, and you kind of get 10 lakh back even after a year or two, you kind of feel that, okay, I got my money back, but I learned a lot of things on the way. So it was it's something like a learning experience, and anything that comes on top of it is just icing on the cake. So that's, I think, the benchmark that we had also set in for us, that, this is the X amount of capital we had put in, and this is what we should at least try to get back as soon as possible. And anything above that is going to be, just icing on the cake. Calculations and everything, I think in the restaurant industry, in the food industry, what happens in Excels do not translate entirely in real life scenarios. So, even in my calculations, I had estimated that, the first crore that we do in revenues, that's when we actually take out the money that we had put in, considering this is the rent expense, this is the cheese expense, this is the salary expense. So the day we do like 1 crore of revenue, we are sure we'll get our principal back, and anything up after that is just going to be profits coming in over the years. And to be honest, we did a crore revenue, I think in the 6th month, the 7th month, cumulative crore. And we had not made a single amount of money at that time, and it was, the Excels went for a toss, that it just doesn't translate. Then we did the second crore, it didn't make money even then the third. So it was like, I would say the benchmarks, I think, go for a toss most of the times. So as long as you kind of enjoy the experience that you're doing and you built a solid product, the time will come when you will reap benefits out of it, but you can't actually put it on paper. So, we thought that for the first 2 years, we actually did not make money. It was only before the pandemic, I think 3 months before the pandemic, that we actually started making profits. And, when we deep dived into this, we actually started making money from day one. But it was, because some of the decisions that we took on the way, we started another brand. As soon as our first brand was started, we started a salad brand in like the second or third month. And then first we had thought that we'll put it in the same kitchen, but then we had to take another kitchen. So the expenses at one point, it was like we were making 3-4 lakhs a month from the pizza brand, and we were burning 3-4 lakhs a month of the salad brand. So net, we were not making anything. And the realization only came after 8-9 months, which were already probably burnt around 20-25 lakhs in this operation of the salad brand. So I think most of this learnings come at a price, and that's what happened with us as well.
Sure. And like further down the line, you also ended up using venture debt to finance some of your operations. So this is something that not a lot of people talk about, that how important, or what is the use case for using debt when you're trying to finance an early stage startup. So can you talk a little bit about it? What were your goals when you
Sure.
did this?
So, as a lot of listeners here would know or not know that now early stage companies, startups, they find it very difficult to get normal loans from normal banks out there. So, until unless you're a 3-year-old company, a bank would not even look at your file. Until unless you are profitable, a bank would not even look at your loan application. So, what has happened over the years is that a lot of NBFCs have cropped up, and these NBFCs are ready to take risks. Their risk appetite is way more than a normal bank, although that's also because their interest rates are also almost double of what a normal bank charges. So you kind of end up paying almost a flat rate of 11%, 12% on a business loan. And but the good thing is that what these NBFCs do is they kind of get into agreements with these aggregators, Zomato and Swiggy, wherein they kind of see what your business is, and then based on the business that you're doing on those platforms, you get a revenue based finance loan, which is backed by the data of Zomato or Swiggy, that this XYZ brand is doing 10 lakhs a month. So it has that capacity to pay 1 lakh as an EMI. So what we can do is we can give them a 30 lakh loan over a 3-year period, and they will be very easily able to afford it and then pay it off. So that's what happened with us. There was this NBFC Indifi, which had a tie-up with Zomato. They kind of looked at our revenues and they offered a certain amount of loan for us. And we took that loan. We financed our business. I think we took a loan at the second year. Uh, we were able to use that amount at the second year. We were able to open 2 more cloud kitchens from that money. And then once the amount was about to get over, we took a top up of that loan from the same NBFC. So I think over the times, what's good is happening is that there are NBFCs which are ready to give loans based on your revenue, which was not the case before. And now what's happening is with GST working in sync with revenues, there are banks also who are ready to give you loans based on your GST returns. So what is happening is your GST returns can actually work as a valid data, which can show that XYZ company is paying 4 lakhs as GST return. In a market where let's say it's paying 5 lakhs as GST returns in a month. That means they're making a crore of revenue because the GST bracket that we work in is at 5%. So this has changed, and this is going to help entrepreneurs in the future. So as long as the compliance of your tax returns are good, you will be able to get loans to fund your business. And that's the same thing that happened with us, although not with GST, but with the revenue that we would do.
So like you have continuously mentioned that like after you started, a lot of players have entered this market, offering a lot more services and covering a lot more food segments. And even during the pandemic, we saw high-end restaurant chains as well pivot to the cloud kitchen model to serve their customers and reduce rent costs. So do you feel that the cloud kitchen space has peaked, or do you feel there's still scope for new entrants, new value propositions to come in?
So see what's happening is you see it in this way that most of the cities most of the tier 1 cities in India are already overpopulated. So they're not growing cities, right? The number of people living in them will remain almost the same, will probably grow by 1% or 2% year on year, not more than that. But the kind of restaurants that are growing, I think it's at more than a 10%, 15% a year. So there's definitely an asymmetry between the supply and the demand here. And over the years, what has happened is from the same kitchen, you open 5 brands. So what has happened is earlier, if there were 100 kitchens, in a night, it can become 500 kitchens because from the same locations, without even a lot of effort. And the whole industry kind of, and even the restaurant industry kind of during the pandemic looked at this side of the business where they thought that they could also have delivery only kitchens. They could also have cloud kitchen brands, and that would just be additional revenue coming in. So what has actually happened is that there is actually a big asymmetry between demand and supply, and the supply side is actually increasing over the years. The demand doesn't increase at that pace. The only way for demand to increase in this market is that the customers that are ordering food, their velocity of ordering goes up. So if they start ordering, so if you remember earlier, people used to order once a week. I think in 2013, 14, it was something that you did once a week. When the aggregators came in, people started ordering twice a day, sorry, twice a week. Then I think over the years, thrice a week, four times a week. I think in COVID, people started ordering 5, 6 times a week when they're at home. They don't want cooks to come in. So the only way for this to increase that, eventually we reach a stage where kitchens are not even a part of a modern household. That, an ideal household would not even have a kitchen. Whatever you want to eat, you would order, whether it's a home cooked style food, a normal North Indian dish, or a pizza. Everything you eat, you order, and it comes in 20, 30 minutes. So what will that make is that from that, 6 years back when people used to order once a week, now a customer is ordering twice a day. So his ordering volume is 14 times a week. So that's the only way for the demand curve to go up here. And that is actually happening. So I think people on an average now, Indians order twice or thrice a week, which is a big change because on an average, Indian ordered once a month. So I think only with this effect that the demand and the supply gap decreases, but it doesn't happen at a rapid pace. And you also have to understand that the attrition rate in restaurants and cloud kitchens is very high. So for every 1,000 that open up every year, there are at least 700, 800 that shut as well. So the eventual difference is just 100 or 200 that come in, because not everyone can take the heat, not everyone can afford the losses, not everyone is patient enough to wait for a long time. But yeah, there's definitely an asymmetry. There's always a lot of options for customers. The barriers to entry is negligible, right? In a restaurant, there are multiple barriers. There are 20, 30 licenses that you have to apply for. There's interior work that you have to pay for. There are multiple things. So a lot of people don't actually get into a restaurant. But a cloud kitchen is barrier free. So anyone, any day can come and start a new kitchen. So there's definitely asymmetry between the demand and supply. But slowly and steadily, the whole consumption basket is also increasing. So, if there were $10 billion worth of orders in 2018, today we're looking at, I think, $20 billion worth of orders, and hoping that it goes up to, let's say, 100 billion in the next few years.
But when we look at the total addressable market or the TAM of cloud kitchens or the restaurant space, or even what Zomato considers its TAM, it considers the entire urban space as a target addressable market in the near future. So do you think that we have reached that point where tier 2 and 3 cities can become feasible options for cloud kitchens to expand, or there are still reservations against that?
No, so to be honest, tier 2 and tier 3 cities are very lucrative because the customer expects. So you have to understand from the customer's expectations as well. So a customer in Delhi and Gurgaon is exposed to multiple restaurants and multiple cloud kitchens. His taste palette has become more refined. So for him, even a good pizza would taste average because he's eaten a better pizza out here. Whereas in a tier 2, tier 3 city, because these guys don't have a standard, don't have a benchmark, of having eaten at, let's say, hundreds of pizzerias, even a good pizza would taste very well for them. So in that sense, it becomes very easier for cloud kitchen operators to kind of win that customer base compared to a customer living in Bangalore or Delhi or Bombay or Gurgaon for that matter. Second thing is, even because the density is of these cities is spread around a very small geographical area, it's very easier for you to open 1 or 2 locations and then serve the entire city. And because there's not a lot of traffic, there's not a lot of congestion, the delivery times are also getting better and better over the years. So considering these plus points, these are very lucrative markets. And I think it's just a mere assumption that there's no spending power in tier 2, tier 3 cities. I think the spending power in tier 2 cities is very high. It's just that these people don't get a lot of options to spend at. Given a chance, they would very happily spend money at these good restaurants that might come up. So I think in the next 2 years, the bigger transformation that you will see is a lot of options opening up in these cloud tier 2 cities. I think Domino's, for that matter, also does a bulk of its business from tier 2 cities compared to what it does in tier 1. In tier 1 cities, people are now bored of Domino's. Whereas in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, Domino's is still a novelty factor, right? It still has a novelty factor. It's a new experience for a lot of people. So I guess the charm of that tier 2, tier 3 cities, it's not going away, and it's a very lucrative business and a spot to get in.
Got it. And recently, there have been talks of a new business model coming up called the co-cooking model. So do
Yeah.
you feel this taking off in India, given the space constraint and the rent expenses?
So I know a lot of people who are in this space and know a lot of companies that do this. My reservations for this is that what happens is in a normal business, you kind of wait for a year or 2 years for your business to mature so that in the third, fourth year, you start to reap in the dividends and the profits. It takes a year or 2 years to build customers, build a customer trust, to, perfect your product, to perfect your logistics. What happens in the co-working spaces is basically is basically one big area where there are 7 8 kitchen operators working, right? And they pay a certain amount of rent. They pay a certain amount of, either they pay a fixed rent or they pay a part of their revenue, right? Whether it's 6% or 7% of the revenue. Now what happens, what I feel is that once a restaurant also takes a space and operates in a co-cooking space for a year, in a year they will earn a good chunk of customers. They will earn a good chunk of they will get whether that area works for them or not. If it doesn't work for them, even then they will leave. If it works for them, they will look to leave that place and take their own space, because the co-cooking space is not giving you a bigger space. It's giving you 300 square feet or 400 square feet space. So there's a limit to what you can grow there. You can go up to let's say 15 20 lakh revenue, but you're looking at a 40 lakh revenue. You can't do it at 300 square feet space. So what will happen is after a year you will actually decide to take your own space, and then you will ditch that co-cooking space provider. So imagine a business where the time when you will actually start making more returns from the tenants is the time when they will leave. Because if I am doing good business, I will take my own space, and if I'm not doing good business, I'll shut. So it's a business where every year you're scouting for new people, because the good people tend to leave and the bad people eventually leave. So in that scenario, I think it's not a very good model. But what it's doing is that it's enabling a lot of people to experiment. So for us also, if you see, it's a blessing that a lot of areas we would have never ventured out. We can now. We can try there. We can go to these locations, try for a few months, 6 months, 9 months, 10 months, and then take a call whether we should operate there or not. Earlier, there was no way to do that. There was no way to try out a space. So I think in that sense, it makes sense as well. But on a business side, it's not a very a lucrative model.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. A lot of times, customer acquisition costs are also something that prohibits players from entering this industry, and they can be especially high when you are building a brand right from scratch. So, how did you go about acquiring customers, and do you think that ultimately pricing or discounting is the only lever that you have to play with when it comes to acquisition?
So I guess what has changed over the years is that with the aggregators coming in, pumping a lot of money. So all the money that these aggregators pump in the market is also to inform the customers, to educate the customers for their own sake. And the aggregators actually give you a platform to market your brands. So it becomes very easy. So for me as a normal brand without a Zomato and Swiggy, the only way for me to market my brand was to send out flyers, or maybe use Instagram at that time, or maybe take up hoardings. All of them would have had been expensive, but you would have not known the direct result of it. So what happens is, as they say in advertisement, is a very famous line that 50% of your ad budget works. You don't know which 50. So the same thing would happen to us here. But because the Matter and Swiggy, they give you detailed, insights that 100 people were targeted and 30 orders came in from those 100 people who were targeted. So it's kind of there's more science to this marketing and this customer acquisition process. So that's kind of something that we followed from the start. We started taking up ads on Zomato, ads on Swiggy. We started evaluating both ads. We saw the timelines as the orders were coming in and all the insights and the data that came in from both these players. So like I think in the initial year, our customer acquisition cost was limited to I think somewhere around I think 20 or 30 rupees a customer, and the average ordering value was 700. So it was a very low cost for us to acquire these new customers. And once you acquire them, you don't have to re-spend on them again, because they actually, if they like the food, they will come back. They don't like the food, no matter how much ad you do, they're not coming back. So the CAC part actually gets solved in a big way due to the aggregators that play in the food space. And I think the commissions that they charge, to be honest, that's more like a customer acquisition charge, because there's no way in hell they're going to get an aggregator or a space where you can target a lakh customers or 10 lakh customers in your area in one space, right? So I think the fact that they got these tens and lakhs of customers in one platform is what they charge for.
Sure. And since now that you mentioned Zomato and Swiggy, was there ever a time that you explored starting your own delivery services directly to the consumers? And do you feel it is sustainable along with managing Zomato and Swiggy partnership?
So to be honest, it's not sustainable at all. But what happens is we do have a delivery fleet from day one. Uh, because of the kind of cuisine that we operate in, it's a pizza. If it's not handled well, it goes upside down, topsy turvy, and the toppings fall from one end to the other. And more often than not, people don't handle food very well with the aggregator delivery boys. So initially we start getting response from the customers that the pizza has come upside down, the cheese is here, the toppings are there. So you gotta take care of that. So just to cut that issue, we had to start our own fleet. And till date, we have a good chunk of riders which of our own, which help deliver the food whenever we feel that the Zomato or Swiggy riders are unable to do it. And of course, they also kind of deliver the food for the direct orders that we get, whether it's on the phone or on our own website or on our web app. Now, delivering a fleet is expensive, maintaining a fleet is even more expensive, and you have to pay them a fixed salary. You can't pay them based on the number of orders they're doing. So it's kind of like a fixed cost that you kind of burden yourself with. So as long as you don't have plans to create a large chain operation, a large scale operation spread out of the city, there's no reason enough to kind of get a whole delivery fleet of your own. Till the time you're looking at just 2 outlets, 3 outlets, it makes sense to just depend on the Zomato and Swiggy. If the order comes, they will send a rider. If they don't send a rider, the order won't come. So on the books, profitability side and the revenue cost side, I think it also makes more sense to not have a delivery fleet. If you're not doing pizza, any other category, it's very easy. They can carry the food even if it goes upside down. There's nothing, no harm that happens to the food. Pizza is kind of a critical category.
Sure. And you mentioned that like while deciding your menu and deciding the raw material and the kind of flavors that you will be putting in, you went to a lot of places, explored, try to take out the best of everything. But I feel that this space is very fickle and it's the taste is completely subjective to the consumer and you never know what he or she is going to like. So how did you incorporate that customer feedback in your menu, and what kind of experiments did you carry out? How did you go about it, like preparing your entire menu range?
So a very interesting question here, because see, you can't sell what you like, because what you like might not be liked by others. You also can't sell what others like, because there's no one thing that people like. You know, people, I think with 10 people, there will be 10 different variations of the same food that they like. And someone would like it more salty, someone would like it less salty, someone would like it spicy, less spicy, more tomato, less tomato, more cheese, less cheese, more toppings, less toppings. There are multiple variations that can happen with 10 people as well. And here we are catering to, let's say, 100,000, 200,000 people. There was no way that we could incorporate the suggestions of across the board, and also no way that we could do something that we like. I think the key here is to just make sure that the ingredients are good, the palate is balanced, the taste is balanced, so that someone would not call it very spicy and someone should also not call it not spicy at all. So there should be a good balance across everything that you're putting in, and the quality of the ingredients at the end play the biggest role here. And that's what we did. We kind of created products where we thought, yeah, they're good and people should like it. It's not that something that we like for sure, but we know that because the combination going in is very good with the raw materials and ingredients going in and the recipes going in. So it definitely would attract a good audience. And that's what we did. So it was something that whatever we created, not more often than not, it was not liked by us as well, or maybe a big chunk of customers, but in its entirety on its own, it was a good product. And because it stood out on its own, it actually could have garnered a big response from the audience, and that's what it did.
Great, that makes complete sense. So, but one problem that you mentioned that Domino's is facing right now is that it has like people in tier one cities have become too used to it and they want to try something new even when it comes to pizzas. So sooner or later, any other cloud kitchen or any other company that is offering something new would eventually run into the same problem again. So how do you ensure that you keep on revamping your menu, or you give them some special discounts, do some add-on services? What is it that makes people still want to come to that same brand again and again?
Yeah, that renovation, changing the menu, making modifications, that's a continuous journey in the food space. It's not static, it's flow. So, you have to kind of keep doing it every few months, whether it's 6 months, 9 months. You have to kind of enhance the menu. You have to give more options to customers. That's something that every company faces. I think the case of Domino's, what happens is eventually, man marke, where will you go? Whenever you want a 20-minute delivery, that's the only place that can give you food, right? Whenever you want a quick delivery. So I think it's playing till date, they're playing more on the delivery uniqueness than the food. So people are not ordering Domino's because it's the best pizza. They're ordering it because it's the fastest pizza that comes to you. So till the time there's no brand that comes in, no company that comes in to kind of target them in that specific area. That we'll open 200 outlets across, we'll open one outlet across every Domino's there is, and we'll try to catch that same customer. They are in a safe space. As long as that doesn't happen. Other players, of course, they have to renovate. And even Domino's for that matter, eventually has to re-innovate. So they kind of keep making these small changes across the menu every year. They keep on adding different sides. They keep on adding different things. So they keep making these changes, and that's something that every brand eventually has to do. So what happens is at a Domino's level, you can afford to make these changes in a year or very slowly because one single change has to be replicated across a big chunk of presence that they have. Whereas for a small player, it's very easy to make these changes across a small presence that they are. But of course, whatever size you operate in, the smaller the size, the more changes you have to make. And the bigger the size, the less changes you can do and still afford. So for a McDonald's, if I walk into a McDonald's store today, I can't tell whether it's 2006 or 2021. Good, because they were selling the same items back 15 years back as well. Maybe a minor modifications here or there. So there's also that famous line, right? If it's not, why fix it if it's not broken? So that also applies sometimes. But as long as you don't become a big brand, innovation is a very critical cog in this wheel of business that you're doing.
Sure. And now, like, I had a question that has been in my mind for so long. So, when it comes to the name of your brand, which is Pizza on My Plate or Burger in My Box, it's quite different from the usual one letter or two letter
Yeah.
brands you encounter, be it Avan Story, Mojo Pizza, Domino's, stuff like this. So, was there any particular reasoning you chose these names? What was going in your mind?
So actually, for Pizza on My Plate, before we started it, we spent in a lot of time deciding what should we name it. We spent weeks, months iterating different name suggestions, discussing, throwing a lot of names at each other. Should we name it this? Should we name it that? And eventually, what we realized was, well, what keywords play a big role in the online space. So when you want a pizza, you search pizza on that app, right? So what we initial thought was that if we name a brand Pizza on My Plate, the suggestion would actually show us before most of the other players. And then we thought, okay, but if we want to do pizza, what do we go with? And then we were just one day randomly, brainstorming, and we decided, oh, let's call it Pomp, which could be Pizza on My Plate. And we call it Pomp most of the times, but for people who want to know what the full form is, it would be written Pizza on My Plate as well. So it serves both the purposes. It is a unique one-word name as well, and it also helps us in the search algorithm, and it also is a full-fledged name at the same time. It also signifies what we're doing. And what we had done at that time was we created a box that actually had four plates on top. So a box actually on the top part of the box gets cut. There's a perforation. So what happens? You can tear down four plates from there, and every plate is as big as a slice. So whenever you're eating a pizza, you can tear out a plate, put your slice, and eat it there. You don't need to use cutlery at home or wherever you're eating it. So that's why the whole name was Pizza on My Plate, because we were actually giving a plate inside the box. And then once that clicked, we thought it makes sense to also start a burger brand and call it Burger in My Box. We call it Bimbox. It clicks. It's a one-word name. It also signifies what we want to do, and yeah, it also kind of worked very well with the customers. So I guess that random brainstorming but session helps us, and also the fact that we kind of played, not just gave it a name, but also gave it a significance wherein we put in a plate inside that box. That actually made the name. There was some sense to that name. It was just not randomly calling it pizza on the plate.
Yeah, that's a very interesting concept, like coupling it with plates. So, like when it comes to expansion, or like when it even comes to starting your first store, how do you narrow down on a location? What are the factors you look at? How do you decide like this is the right place to start a cloud kitchen?
I guess critical thing here is density. Wherever you feel that there are more areas that you can capture, more people that you can capture is where you should go. You should not try with offbeat locations. Don't ever start with offbeat locations because a lot of people get attracted by offbeat locations because they feel there's not a lot of competition. So let's start in these offbeat locations, work our way through to these densely populated areas. But what people forget is that although there's no competition because there's not a lot of customers, both of them follow each other. Wherever there's a lot of customers, competition will automatically arrive. So I guess the safer play here is find a high density area where you yourself might live, yourself might transact, yourself might eat and shop, and target these areas initially. We realized that there was a sweet spot in South Delhi where we kind of got an area which was equidistant from a lot of densely populated areas. Already had a good customer base, already had a lot of customer awareness, already had a lot of players. So that worked very well for us. So I guess the critical factor here is density of population. Wherever you can get more people per square foot, closest, it makes more sense because eventually what happens is you will realize in long run you do almost 80% of your business in a 2 kilometer radius or a 3 kilometer radius. And if your 3 kilometer radius does not have a lot of people, it just doesn't make sense to open a store.
Got it. So like it's been almost, I think, yeah, as you mentioned, 4 years since you have been running this business. And recently you have also started working as an angel investor with Point One Capital. So now that you have worked across both sides of the business, what are some things that you feel entrepreneurs get wrong uh, when you look at it from investment perspective, and some things that entrepreneurs should keep in mind while raising money?
So I guess a lot of people today just want to reverse engineer a sale of their company or a fundraise. So a lot of people get into the space just to sell it at a certain point, right? So they kind of know that in 5 years time I'll sell my company at this valuation, right? And then they reverse engineer their way to that, right? So what they do is, okay, I will reach this benchmark, I will get to this losses, I will compromise on the revenue, I will put a lot of money in marketing because I have to reach this certain benchmark and then I can sell my company. I think as long as you're not enjoying the work that you're doing, if you're not enjoying that space, if you don't have a passion to do that business for a long time, you should not get into it. If you eventually feel that this is not something you want to do for 5 years, there's no reasoning for you to get into that space and raise money. Uh, and when it comes to investors, I think the environment has become so open now over the last 2 years. There's a lot of money on the table. There's a lot of investors' interest on the table. Every idea is getting funded. Every good idea is getting a lot of funding. Even pre-revenue companies are getting multi-million dollar checks. So the environment has become very conducive to entrepreneurship today. Money is there, but what happens is I think between VCs as well. Now the fight is about the reputation of the VC that comes in, the support that they can give, because I think money is something that is available to everyone today. So I guess for people who are looking to raise money, as long as you're dedicated towards the product, as long as you know the ins and outs of your company, and as long as you have the passion for that industry, I think it wouldn't be very difficult to raise money. And you also can't fool the investor by kind of creating a fake passion around the play that you have, because I think these investors, because they see through 300s and 400s of people every year or every month, they have this knack for pulling out fake enthusiasm and real enthusiasm. So I guess if you're actually very passionate about your field or your product, raising money would, I think, be the least of your concern.
Fair enough. What was the biggest setback you observed in your startup journey, and how did you overcome it?
Uh, I mean, there are multiple setbacks, and I couldn't pinpoint one, to be honest. There were a lot. There still are a lot. I guess the biggest factor that we see is uh, the business that we operate in. We hire a lot of blue collar people. So what happens is the attrition rates are always very high. So you get good people, you train them, you like their work, but they kind of move on because they get, let's say, a 5% or 10% increment somewhere else. So what happens is, I think we have had setbacks wherein we've lost very good chefs, very good managers, very good delivery boys, just because they got a 5% hike somewhere else. So it's not a business where they kind of like stick for a long period. So I think when the first time when we saw this, attrition happening, that was the time when we felt it was a big setback. But now over the years, we've seen it multiple times happening. So it doesn't feel like a setback anytime someone, puts in their papers. But the problem here is I think good companies are built by good people, and good people are built over years. So what happens is that's something that we kind of miss here in this industry. We don't have a lot of people who stick for long here. So as long as they don't stick for long, you can't create big companies and you can't create, greater enterprises. That's something that's still missing in this industry. And till the time you don't find a solution for this, till the time the people don't realize that there is a long-term plan in place, and there's a long-term gain that they can actually get by staying for a longer period in this enterprise or wherever they're working, you won't see greater companies coming out. So I think that was the initial setbacks that we saw, and there were multiple on the way, uh, with the aggregators, over multiple things. These aggregators change their algorithms overnight. The rating system changes overnight. Customers kind of threaten you a lot of times. Customers write bad reviews. So I think you go through the whole process. A 1 star hurts a lot when it comes in your initial phase, and then starts hurting less over the period. So I guess multiple setbacks, but not one to pinpoint.
Sure. So, last question, Tushar. What is an advice you would have given to your younger self who is just starting out his own company, and this is his first entrepreneurship experience?
I guess it would have been take a lot of risk, expand as soon as you can, and focus on what you're doing. Right, there will be a lot of things in the way where, as I said, start a salad brand, something that we shouldn't have done. So it was like, don't try to put your legs in two boats, right? Then you will not reach your destination. It just makes sense to catch hold of one boat and get it, sail it through the river, and then you will eventually end up in a place where success awaits you. So I guess the fact that choose a core competency that you have, choose a product that you like to sell, create a business around it, and expand it. Don't try to sell or do multiple things at the same time. So if you think that your pizza is good, just sell your pizza across different categories. If you think your burger is good, sell it across different geographies. Don't start selling a burger, a pizza, and a salad at the same time. I think that was something that we would do if given an option today.
That's
There's a reason
that's
that McDonald's did not get into North Indian or Asian, or pizza for that matter. I'm sure that money is not the issue. They could have easily opened a pizza chain, right? But they know that a core competency is making burgers, making very good burgers across, and that's what we'll do. There's a reason Domino's doesn't do burgers. It's not that they can't afford to do it. So I guess that core competency selection and then sticking to it is very important here.
that's great advice, Tushar. Thanks a lot for your time, Tushar. Thank you for doing this. I think this was hugely insightful, and a lot of young entrepreneurs, be it in the restaurant business or any other business who are starting up, will find a lot of useful advice or useful insights to work on. So thanks for your time, Tushar. Hope you enjoyed talking to me.
Very, very happy to share whatever learnings we have had, and we'll be more happy if a lot of people, take advice from this and learn and probably skip the mistakes that we did, and eventually end up in a great space wherever they are. So thanks for inviting me, Trouble.
Sure. Thank you, Tushar. And that's a wrap from our end.